Sharon adjusted her crisp white apron, smoothing the fabric nervously as she stood in the bustling kitchen of the bistro. The tantalizing aroma of simmering sauces and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with the occasional clatter of pans and the hum of orders being called out. It was her first day, and though she had spent weeks preparing for this opportunity, the reality of standing in such a sophisticated establishment made her heart race. The head chef, a stern but meticulous woman named Margot, cast a quick glance at Sharon. "You're on salads and prep today," Margot said, her tone brisk. "Prove you can handle that, and we'll talk about more." Sharon nodded, biting back her nerves. "Got it," she replied, moving to her station. Her hands moved swiftly as she washed, chopped, and arranged an array of fresh vegetables, her training kicking in. She couldn't help but sneak glances at the other chefs, their movements fluid and synchronized like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Each dish they plated seemed more exquisite than the last. By mid-morning, Sharon felt herself easing into the rhythm of the kitchen. She worked quietly, focusing on her tasks, but also took mental notes of how the others handled their stations. She noticed how the sous chef added a dash of spice with a flick of his wrist, or how Margot inspected each plate with an eagle eye before it left the pass. It was inspiring to witness such precision and artistry in every step. During a short lull, one of the other line cooks, a cheerful man named Daniel, leaned over and whispered, "First day's always the hardest." "You're doing great." Sharon smiled appreciatively. "Thanks. I just don't want to mess up." "You won't," Daniel assured her. "And if you do, Margot will make sure you never forget it." They both laughed quietly, their moment of camaraderie cut short as a new wave of orders came in. Sharon dove back into her work, determined to keep up. The hours flew by in a blur of slicing, seasoning, and plating, each motion bringing a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, her passion for cooking reignited by the energy of the bistro. As the lunch rush wound down, Sharon found herself with a brief moment to breathe. She wandered to the edge of the kitchen, peeking out into the dining area. The restaurant was elegant, with its polished wood floors, softly glowing chandeliers, and tables adorned with pristine white linens. Customers chatted over their meals, their faces lit with contentment. It was exactly the kind of place she had dreamed of working in when she was a little girl, helping her father in the family diner. A sudden wave of nostalgia washed over her, and she turned back to the kitchen to refocus her thoughts. She had worked hard to get here, and she wasn't about to let herself get lost in memories now. There was too much at stake. By the time the dinner service began, Sharon had found her stride. Margot even gave her a rare nod of approval after sampling one of her garnishes, which sent a surge of pride through her chest. She was exhausted but happy, her confidence growing with each passing hour. At the end of her shift, Sharon stayed behind to clean her station, unwilling to leave a single thing out of place. Daniel passed by on his way out, tossing her a smile. "Careful, or you'll set the bar too high for the rest of us." Sharon laughed softly. "Just trying to make a good impression." "You're doing more than that," he said before disappearing through the door. Sharon lingered a moment, soaking in the quiet of the now empty kitchen. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she belonged. As she stepped out into the cool night air, Sharon allowed herself a small smile. The first day was over, and she had survived. More than that, she had thrived. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she let herself savor the simple joy of chasing a dream. The bistro had quieted after the late lunch rush, the hum of conversation in the dining area replaced by the clinking of glassware being polished and the soft shuffling of chairs being rearranged. Sharon stood at the far end of the room, her hands deftly wiping down a table. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting warm golden hues across the walls adorned with framed photographs of smiling faces, chefs in their whites, and moments frozen in time. As she moved closer to the wall, one particular picture caught her eye. A man with kind, familiar eyes stood in the center of a group, his arm draped casually over a younger man's shoulder. His hair was darker than she remembered, his face free of the lines etched by time and worry, but there was no mistaking him. It was her father. Her breath caught, and her heart pounded as she stared at the image, her thoughts spinning. Sharon stepped closer, her fingers grazing the edge of the frame. Surrounding her father were several other people, 2 women, a teenage boy, and a man slightly older than him. They all stood in front of what looked like the very bistro she was standing in. Her father had never mentioned this place. He rarely talked about his family at all, other than vague comments that usually ended with a heavy sigh and a subject change. Yet here he was, a younger version of himself, smiling as though this place had once meant something to him. Her curiosity outweighed her hesitation. She turned, searching for someone who might know more. Spotting Robert, the bistro's manager, standing by the counter, she approached him carefully, clutching the cleaning cloth in her hand like a talisman. "Robert," she began hesitantly, trying to keep her tone casual, "can I ask you something?" He glanced up from the clipboard he was reviewing, raising a skeptical brow. "Make it quick. We've got prep for dinner service coming up." She gestured toward the wall. "That photo over there, the man in the middle. That's my dad. Michael." For a moment, Robert's expression remained impassive. Then his eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the clipboard. "Your father," he repeated, his tone sharp enough to make Sharon flinch. "Yes," she said, trying to maintain her composure despite the sudden shift in his demeanor. "I was just wondering, who are the others in the photo? And why is it here?" Robert's face hardened, and he took a step closer to her. "That's none of your business," he said curtly. "Focus on your job and leave the past where it belongs." Sharon blinked, caught off guard by his hostility. "I didn't mean to pry. I just thought." "You thought wrong," Robert interrupted, his voice low but firm. "And since you seem more interested in playing detective than doing your work, maybe this isn't the place for you." Her stomach dropped. "Wait, are you firing me?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. Robert's expression didn't waver. "Clear out your locker. You're done here." The words hit her like a blow, leaving her momentarily speechless. She opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes silenced her. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her mind racing. She had been so careful, so determined to make this job work. And now, because of one innocent question, it was over. In the small locker room, she packed her belongings in a daze, her emotions swinging between confusion and anger. Why had Robert reacted so strongly? What was it about that photo that made him so defensive? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, something hidden beneath the surface. As she stepped out into the cool afternoon air, the weight of the situation fully sank in. She had lost her chance at the bistro, a place she had dreamed of working in, for reasons she couldn't even fully comprehend. The ache in her chest grew as she thought about how proud her father would have been to see her there. She had wanted so badly to honor his memory, to follow in his footsteps. And now, it felt like she had let him down. Sharon walked slowly toward the bus stop, her mind replaying the events of the day. She couldn't help but question herself. Had she pushed too far? Should she have let it go? The thought gnawed at her, but so did the image of her father in that photo, his smile so genuine and at ease. She had to know more. But where would she even start? As she sat on the bench, waiting for the bus, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, half hoping it was someone from the bistro calling to tell her there had been a mistake. Instead, it was a text from her mom. "How's your day going, sweetie?" Sharon hesitated before typing back, "It's been a tough one. I'll tell you about it later." She didn't want to burden her mom just yet. Her mother had enough on her plate, working long hours to make ends meet. Still, Sharon couldn't help but wonder if her mom knew more about her father's past than she had let on. Growing up, her mom had always been evasive when Sharon asked about her dad's family. Maybe now was the time to press for answers. The bus arrived with a loud hiss, and Sharon stepped on, dropping into a seat by the window. As the city streets blurred past, she tried to focus on her next steps. She had to find another job, of course. But more than that, she needed to make sense of what had happened today. The image of that photograph lingered in her mind, like a puzzle waiting to be solved. What had her father been hiding? And why did it seem like Robert wanted to keep it hidden, too? By the time Sharon reached her apartment, the sky was streaked with shades of pink and orange. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of her mother's cooking greeting her. Her mom looked up from the stove, her face lighting up with a smile that quickly faded when she saw Sharon's expression. "Bad day?" her mom asked gently. Sharon nodded, setting her bag down. "You could say that. Want to talk about it?" "Not yet," Sharon replied. "But soon." Her mom studied her for a moment before nodding. "Okay. Dinner will be ready in 10. Sharon offered a small smile and headed to her room. She needed time to process, to figure out what her next move would be. Lying on her bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind drifting back to the photo. She didn't know what the answers were, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't rest until she found them. Sharon sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts drifting back to when life felt simpler, even if it wasn't always easy. Her childhood memories were a patchwork of laughter, warm kitchens, and the comforting aroma of her father's cooking. Michael, her dad, had been a man of boundless energy and optimism, the kind of person who could brighten even the darkest day with his smile. Her earliest memories were of him standing behind the counter of their small family diner, a white apron tied around his waist, his hands expertly flipping pancakes or plating a towering burger. The diner wasn't fancy, it was the kind of place where regulars came for a good meal and a friendly chat. To Sharon, it had felt magical. She loved watching her father move with such confidence and joy, as if the kitchen were his stage and he the star performer. Her mom, Judith, had worked hard too, managing the books and keeping the diner running smoothly. She wasn't a cook, but she had a knack for creating a warm atmosphere that drew people in. Together, her parents had been a perfect team, building a space that felt like home not just for their family but for the entire neighborhood. Sharon grew up in that diner, spending hours perched on a stool behind the counter, scribbling in her coloring books or helping her dad by fetching ingredients from the pantry. She'd giggle as he let her stir sauces or sprinkle cheese on a dish, always encouraging her to get her hands dirty and try new things. "Cooking's not about perfection," he'd say with a wink. "It's about heart." When Sharon was about 10, her father started teaching her real techniques. How to hold a knife properly, the difference between a simmer and a boil, the magic of balancing flavors. He had a way of making everything he did seem effortless, but she quickly learned that cooking wasn't just an art, it was also a science, one that required patience and practice. She loved every second of it. As she grew older, the diner became more than just her playground, it became a place of solace. When middle school dramas weighed her down or the challenges of growing up felt overwhelming, the kitchen was where she went to find her footing. Her father would hand her an apron and say, "Let's make something amazing," and for a little while, all her worries would melt away. But life wasn't always kind. When Sharon was 16, her father started getting sick. It began with small things, a persistent cough, fatigue he couldn't shake. At first, they all thought it was just a cold or stress from long hours at the diner. But the diagnosis came like a thunderclap, a rare illness that would slowly sap his strength. The diner, which had once been the heart of their family, became a burden they could no longer manage. Judith made the heartbreaking decision to sell it, knowing it was the only way to afford Michael's medical bills and give him the care he needed. Sharon had fought against it, desperate to hold on to the place where so many of her happiest memories had been made. But in the end, she understood. They had to let it go. The years that followed were hard. Michael's illness progressed, and their once vibrant home grew quieter. Yet even as his body weakened, his spirit never did. He continued to teach Sharon everything he could about cooking, sitting at the kitchen table with her as she experimented with new recipes. He'd offer tips and gentle critiques, his love for food shining through even on his worst days. "Don't just cook what you know," he told her one afternoon as she struggled to perfect a soufflé. "Cook what you feel. That's how you make people remember you." Those words stayed with her long after he was gone. Losing her father was the hardest thing Sharon had ever faced. It felt like the world had lost its color, like the foundation of her life had crumbled. But in her grief, she found clarity. She knew what she wanted to do with her life. She wanted to honor her father's memory by following in his footsteps, by becoming a chef who could bring people joy through food. Her decision wasn't easy for her mother to accept at first. Judith had always been pragmatic, wary of the instability that often came with culinary careers. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she'd asked one evening as Sharon filled out applications for culinary school. "It's not an easy path." Sharon had looked up from her forms, her expression resolute. "It's the only path that feels right." Her mother had nodded, though her concern lingered. But over time, as she saw Sharon's determination and passion, she began to support her daughter's dream wholeheartedly. They worked together to make it happen, scraping together savings and applying for scholarships until Sharon was able to enroll in a prestigious culinary program. Culinary school was a whirlwind of challenges and triumphs. Sharon thrived in the fast-paced environment, absorbing everything she could from her instructors and classmates. She worked long hours, practiced obsessively, and pushed herself to improve every day. Her father's voice was always in the back of her mind, encouraging her, reminding her why she was doing this. Even after graduating, the road wasn't easy. She worked in a series of kitchens, each one a stepping stone toward her goal of becoming a head chef. The work was grueling, the hours long, but she loved it. Every time she plated a dish or crafted a new recipe, she felt closer to her father, as if she were keeping a part of him alive through her craft. Now, sitting in her room, Sharon felt the ache of those memories more keenly than ever. The photograph she'd seen at the bistro had stirred something deep within her, a longing to understand the part of her father's life he had never shared. She thought of the way he used to look at her when they cooked together, the pride in his eyes. What would he think of her now? Would he want her to chase the truth, to uncover the connection between him and that place? Sharon sighed, running a hand through her hair. Her father had always taught her to face challenges head-on, to embrace the unknown with courage. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't stop until she found the answers she was looking for. Sharon sat at the kitchen table, a lukewarm cup of coffee in her hands. The light streaming through the curtains did little to lift her spirits. She had spent the night replaying every moment of the previous day, her mind circling back to the photograph, Robert's harsh reaction, and the abrupt end to what she'd hoped was a new beginning. Her father's image in that photo haunted her. How was he connected to the bistro? And why had Robert been so quick to shut her down? The distant rumble of a car engine broke through her thoughts. Sharon looked up, her brow furrowing as the sound grew louder. Pushing back her chair, she crossed the small living room and peeked through the front window. Her mouth fell open at the sight of a sleek, black limousine pulling up to the curb. The driver stepped out, dressed impeccably in a crisp suit, and adjusted his hat before walking toward her door. A knock echoed through the small house. Sharon hesitated, her heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and unease. She opened the door slowly, staring up at the chauffeur, who offered a polite nod and handed her a thick envelope. "This is for you, Miss Sharon," he said with a calm professionalism that only added to the surreal nature of the moment. She took the envelope, her fingers brushing over the high-quality paper. Embossed on the front was her name in elegant script. "Who sent this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "The sender's name is within," he replied simply. Without another word, he tipped his hat and returned to the car, leaving Sharon standing in the doorway, stunned. She closed the door and moved to the kitchen, the envelope still clutched in her hands. Sitting down, she carefully slid her finger under the seal and unfolded the contents. Inside was an ivory card bordered with gold, the handwriting precise and deliberate. Dear Sharon, it is time you learned more about your father and his family. I am Grace, your grandmother. Please come to the address below. We have much to discuss. Warm regards, Grace. Sharon read the note twice, her mind racing. Grace? Her grandmother? The name felt foreign, like a puzzle piece from a picture she'd never seen. She flipped the card over, but there was no additional information, just an address in a neighborhood she knew was far beyond anything she'd ever visited. Her first instinct was to call her mother. Pulling out her phone, she dialed and waited impatiently as the line rang. Judith picked up after the third ring, her voice cheerful as always. Hey, honey. Everything okay? Sharon didn't waste time on pleasantries. Mom, do you know someone named Grace? She says she's my grandmother. There was a pause, long enough to make Sharon's stomach twist. Where did you hear that name? Judith asked, her tone cautious. I got a letter. From her. A chauffeur just dropped it off with an address. Mom, what's going on? Why haven't I ever heard of her? Judith sighed, the weight of years past evident in the sound. It's complicated, Sharon. Your father and his family, they had their issues. I didn't want you caught up in that. But she's my grandmother, Sharon pressed. Don't I have a right to know her? To know about them? Another pause, shorter this time. You do, Judith admitted. But I need you to understand that their world is very different from ours. Your father left for a reason, Sharon. He loved you, and he loved the life we built, but his family, they had expectations he couldn't meet. Sharon frowned, her grip on the phone tightening. What kind of expectations? Judith's voice softened. Let's just say they weren't thrilled about him marrying me, and they made that clear. He chose us, Sharon. And I chose to leave their world behind. The information was overwhelming, yet it raised more questions than it answered. So, what do I do? Do I go? That's up to you, Judith said gently. I won't tell you what to think of them. I don't want my feelings to influence yours. If you want to meet her, I won't stop you. But promise me you'll keep an open mind. And if you decide it's not for you, walk away. You don't owe them anything. Sharon leaned back in her chair, staring at the letter on the table. I'll think about it. Whatever you decide, Judith said, I'm here for you. After they hung up, Sharon sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the neatly written words in the letter. This wasn't what she'd expected when she woke up this morning. Meeting a grandmother she'd never known, learning about a family her father had kept from her, it felt like stepping into a different world. But the photograph from the bistro flashed in her mind, her father's smiling face surrounded by people she didn't know. Maybe this was her chance to fill in the blanks, to understand a part of him she'd never known. Or maybe it would only lead to more heartache. Either way, she knew she couldn't ignore it. She had to know the truth. Sharon stared out the window of the limousine as it wound through the narrow roads of an affluent neighborhood. The scenery was a world away from anything she'd known, sprawling lawns, ornate gates, and houses so large they seemed more like estates. Her stomach churned with a mix of curiosity and dread. The card in her pocket felt heavy, its elegant script echoing in her mind with every bump of the road. Grace. Your grandmother. The words felt both foreign and familiar, as though they belonged to someone else's story. When the car pulled up to a wrought iron gate, it glided open smoothly, revealing a long driveway lined with tall oak trees. At the end of the path stood a house that could only be described as a mansion, its stone facade imposing yet elegant. The driver stepped out and opened her door. She hesitated, smoothing her dress as though that would somehow prepare her for whatever awaited inside. The front door opened before she even had a chance to knock. A woman stood there, poised and regal, with silver hair swept into a perfect chignon. Her tailored suit was understated yet spoke of wealth and refinement. She studied Sharon with a measured gaze before a small, polite smile graced her lips. "Sharon," she said, her voice rich and steady. "I'm Grace. Please, come in." Sharon nodded, stepping into the foyer. The air inside was cool, scented faintly with fresh flowers. The marble floors gleamed under the light of an elaborate chandelier, and every piece of furniture seemed placed with meticulous care. Sharon felt small, out of place, as though she'd walked into a museum rather than a home. "I appreciate you coming," Grace continued, gesturing toward a sitting room to the left. "There's much to discuss." Sharon followed her, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. The sitting room was just as grand, with high ceilings and antique furniture, but it also felt warmer somehow, the afternoon light streaming in through large windows. Grace motioned for her to sit, then took a chair opposite her. A tea set was already prepared on the coffee table between them. "I imagine this is overwhelming for you," Grace said, pouring a cup of tea and handing it to Sharon. "And I'm sure you have questions." Sharon accepted the tea, though her hands trembled slightly as she held the delicate cup. "I do," she admitted. "I guess I'll start with the obvious. Why now? Why reach out to me after all these years?" Grace sighed, her gaze dropping momentarily before meeting Sharon's again. "I didn't know you existed until recently," she said simply. "Your father, he didn't tell us about you. He left this family many years ago, and we lost contact. When I learned about you, I knew I had to meet you." Sharon's heart tightened at the mention of her father. "Why did he leave?" Grace hesitated, her expression softening. "Michael and I had differences. He married your mother against my wishes, and he felt he couldn't be part of this family anymore. It's something I deeply regret. I never had the chance to make amends with him, and for that, I will always be sorry." Sharon's throat tightened as a swirl of emotions bubbled up: sadness, anger, confusion. She set the tea down, unable to take another sip. "So you disapproved of my mom, and he walked away. And then what? You just let him go?" Grace's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not as simple as that. But I understand why you feel that way." Before Sharon could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. A man entered the room, his sharp suit and confident stride immediately catching her attention. Her chest tightened as recognition hit her. It was Robert, the manager of the bistro, the man who had fired her without a second thought. Her eyes widened. "You," she blurted, unable to mask her shock. "What are you doing here?" Robert stopped short, his expression flickering between surprise and discomfort. "Sharon," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I am you, uncle." "I didn't realize." "You didn't realize what?" she snapped, standing abruptly. "That the girl you fired for asking a simple question would show up here?" Grace stood as well, placing a calming hand on Sharon's arm. "Sharon, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Sharon said, her voice rising. "That he's my uncle? That the man who treated me like dirt is part of this family?" Robert looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't know who you were," he said finally. "And if I had..." "What?" Sharon interrupted. "You would have fired me more politely?" Grace stepped between them, her tone firm but measured. "Enough. This is not the place for anger. Robert, I'll speak with you later." Her words left no room for argument, and after a brief pause, Robert nodded and left the room without another word. Sharon sat back down, her legs feeling weak beneath her. "I don't understand any of this," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "Why didn't he recognize me? Why didn't anyone tell me the truth?" Grace sighed, sitting down as well. "There's no excuse for how you were treated, Sharon. But you must understand, Robert didn't know about you either. None of us did. Your father kept his life with your mother separate from us, and while that was his choice, it left us all in the dark." Sharon shook her head, trying to process everything. "This doesn't feel real. I've spent my whole life wondering why my father never talked about his family, and now I'm here, in this giant house, meeting people who knew him better than I ever did." Grace reached out, her hand resting gently on Sharon's. "I can't change the past," she said softly. "But I want to change the future. You're part of this family, whether you feel it now or not. And I hope, in time, you'll come to see that." Sharon stared at their hands, her emotions warring within her. She wasn't sure if she could trust this woman, this family. But a small part of her, the part that had always longed for a deeper connection to her father, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was where she was meant to be. For now, all she could do was take it one step at a time. The soft ticking of a clock filled the quiet space between Sharon and Grace as they sat in the grand sitting room. The earlier tension had dissipated slightly, but the weight of unspoken truths hung heavy in the air. Sharon stared down at her hands, her thoughts spinning in too many directions. Grace, with her composed demeanor, broke the silence first. "Sharon," she began, her voice steady but tinged with something softer, "I think you deserve to know everything. It's time you understood what happened between your father and this family." Sharon's gaze shifted upward, meeting Grace's. "I've been waiting to hear this my whole life," she said quietly, her words tinged with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Grace leaned back in her chair, clasping her hands in her lap. "Your father, Michael, was my youngest. He was different from the rest of us. While the rest of the family followed tradition, business, finance, law, Michael had this passion for cooking. I'll admit, I didn't understand it at first. To me, it seemed like a hobby, not a life path." Sharon bristled but remained silent, letting Grace continue. "When he met your mother, Judith, I saw it as another way he was rebelling against our expectations. I had my reasons for disapproving of their relationship, though I see now how misguided I was." Grace's voice softened, and she looked away briefly, as though gathering her thoughts. "Judith wasn't from our world. She didn't come from money, from status, and at the time, I foolishly thought that mattered. I worried she would hold him back, that their life together would make him regret what he gave up." Sharon clenched her hands into fists. "What he gave up?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "You mean your approval?" Grace's lips pressed into a thin line before she nodded. "Yes. That, and his place in this family. He made it clear he wasn't interested in the life we envisioned for him. And when I refused to accept Judith, he chose to walk away. I thought he'd come back eventually, but he didn't. Instead, he built a life with her, a life I never had the courage to be a part of." Sharon's chest tightened as she absorbed the words. "You didn't even try to reach out? Not once? He was your son." Grace's expression faltered, a flicker of pain breaking through her poised exterior. "I was stubborn. Prideful. I convinced myself it was better this way. I told myself he didn't want to hear from me, that I was respecting his choice. But the truth is, I was too ashamed to face him, to admit I was wrong." "And you didn't know about me?" Sharon asked, her voice wavering. Grace shook her head, her eyes glistening. "No. If I had known," she trailed off, her gaze dropping to the floor. "It doesn't excuse anything, but I would have done things differently." Sharon leaned back, the weight of the story settling on her shoulders. She wanted to believe Grace's regret was genuine, but the hurt ran deep. "He never talked about you," she said softly. "Not once. I always thought. I thought maybe he didn't have a family." Grace's face crumpled for a brief moment before she composed herself again. "That's my fault. I pushed him away, and he had every right to leave." The sound of footsteps approached, and Sharon turned to see Robert entering the room hesitantly. His usual confidence was absent, replaced by something that almost resembled uncertainty. He stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice awkward and stilted. "For the way I treated you at the bistro. If I had known who you were, I wouldn't have." "Fired me?" Sharon interjected, her words cutting through his attempt. Robert winced but nodded. "Yeah. Look, I was out of line. I didn't mean to upset you. It's complicated." Sharon crossed her arms, her gaze unrelenting. "Complicated how? Because you couldn't answer a simple question about a photo? Or because I reminded you of something you wanted to forget?" Robert looked to Grace for support, but she remained silent, leaving him to face Sharon's pointed stare. "It wasn't about you," he said finally. "That photo, the bistro, this whole family, it's messy. And I guess I took it out on you, which wasn't fair." Sharon's jaw tightened. "No, it wasn't." "I'm sorry," Robert said again, his voice quieter this time. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I hope you'll give me a chance to make it right." Sharon wanted to snap back, to tell him how little his apology meant after everything. But a small voice in her mind reminded her of her father, of the way he had always encouraged forgiveness, even when it was hard. "We'll see," she said finally, her tone cool but not dismissive. Robert nodded, seeming to understand that it was the best he could hope for at the moment. He turned and left the room, leaving Sharon and Grace alone once more. "Robert has his flaws," Grace said after a moment, her tone measured. "But he's family. And family, as you know, isn't perfect." Sharon let out a bitter laugh. "That's putting it lightly." Grace leaned forward, her expression earnest. "I know this is a lot to take in, Sharon. And I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm here now. I want to get to know you, to make up for lost time, if you'll let me." Sharon looked at her grandmother, the woman who had both pushed her father away and now seemed desperate to bridge the gap. It wasn't easy to reconcile the two images in her mind. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of this," she admitted. "I feel like I've been dropped into a world that doesn't belong to me." Grace smiled gently, though her eyes remained somber. "It's your world as much as it's mine. And while I can't change the past, I hope you'll let me be a part of your future." Sharon didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure if she could. Her emotions were too raw, too tangled. But as she sat there, the weight of her father's absence pressing against the ache of newfound truths, she realized one thing: the story wasn't over yet. Whether she liked it or not, it was just beginning. The aroma of freshly baked bread and simmering herbs greeted Sharon as she stepped into the bistro's kitchen for her first shift. It felt surreal to be back in the place where she had so recently been dismissed, this time with a new understanding of the ties that bound her to it. She adjusted her apron, her fingers lingering on the knot as if tightening it would steal her resolve. Around her, the staff bustled with the efficient rhythm of a well-oiled machine, and she couldn't help but feel like an outsider trying to find her place. Margot, the head chef, looked up from her station, her sharp eyes softening slightly. "Good, you're here," she said briskly, gesturing to a prep station. "Let's see what you've got. Chop these, julienne those, and don't skimp on precision." Sharon nodded and got to work, her movements deliberate as she handled the knives. The hum of activity around her was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. She wanted to do well, to prove that she belonged here, not just because of her family name but because she had the skills to earn her spot. Grace had been firm about her inclusion. "This is as much your heritage as it is Robert's," she'd said the day before. "Your father dreamed of being a chef, and while he chose his own path, the heart of this bistro belongs to both of you." Sharon wasn't sure how she felt about the idea of sharing this space with Robert, but the thought of walking away had felt like giving up on a connection to her father she desperately wanted to understand. So here she was, slicing and dicing her way into a legacy she was still trying to grasp. Daniel, one of the line cooks, sidled up next to her, offering a grin. "Back for round 2, huh? Heard you've got a family stake in the place now." Sharon glanced at him, unsure how much to share. "Something like that," she said with a small shrug. "Well, don't let Margot scare you off," he said with a chuckle. "She's tough, but if she sees talent, she'll give you a chance." Sharon appreciated the encouragement but knew it would take more than talent to feel at ease here. The bistro wasn't just about the food, it was a stage for family dynamics that she was still navigating. Her uncle, Robert, had been distant since her return. He avoided eye contact and kept their interactions strictly professional, which suited Sharon just fine. She wasn't ready to forgive him, and she wasn't sure she ever would. As the day progressed, Sharon found herself slipping into the rhythm of the kitchen. The tasks became familiar, her hands moving with more confidence as she prepped vegetables, assembled garnishes, and observed the chefs at work. Margot occasionally nodded in approval, a small but significant sign that she was holding her own. During a quiet moment between orders, Grace appeared at the kitchen door. She wore her usual air of poise, but there was a warmth in her eyes as she watched Sharon work. "How's it going?" she asked, stepping inside. Sharon wiped her hands on her apron. "So far, so good. Margot hasn't kicked me out yet." Grace's lips curved into a small smile. "I wouldn't worry about that. You've always had a knack for this, haven't you?" Sharon hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I learned from the best," she said finally. "My dad." Grace's expression flickered with something Sharon couldn't quite place. Pride, maybe, or regret. "He would be proud to see you here," she said softly. "I hope you know that." Sharon nodded, the words hitting her with more weight than she expected. Before she could respond, Margot called for her to return to her station, and the moment passed. By the end of the shift, Sharon was exhausted but oddly satisfied. She leaned against the counter in the break room, sipping water as she let the day's events sink in. Working here wasn't easy, but it felt meaningful in a way she hadn't anticipated. For all the complications with her family, there was something grounding about being in this space, creating something tangible and worthwhile. As she headed toward the door, Robert intercepted her. He stood awkwardly, his hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said, his tone less confident than usual. Sharon raised an eyebrow. "Hey. I wanted to say you did good today," he said, glancing at her briefly before looking away. Margot doesn't give out compliments lightly. "Thanks," Sharon said, her tone cautious. "Is that all?" Robert hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I know things are strained between us. But I want you to know, this place means a lot to me. And I'm trying to figure out how to make room for you, too." Sharon crossed her arms, unsure how to take his words. "You mean make room for me as your niece or as someone who works here?" "Both," Robert admitted. "I was wrong to push you out before, and I know I've got a long way to go to make up for it. But I'm trying." Sharon studied him for a moment, weighing his sincerity. "I'll believe it when I see it," she said, her tone measured but firm. Robert nodded, accepting her response without argument. "Fair enough. See you tomorrow." As he walked away, Sharon felt a small shift in her chest, just enough to keep the door open, even if only a crack. This place was hers as much as his, and she was determined to make it count. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she was starting to find her footing. One step at a time, she thought. One shift, one meal, one connection at a time. The grand dining room of Grace's mansion was adorned with candlelight, the long table set with intricate china and sparkling glassware. Sharon sat stiffly near one end, her hands resting in her lap as she glanced between her mother and Grace. The tension in the air was palpable, as though everyone had agreed to avoid saying the wrong thing, yet no one knew how to keep it from happening. Her mother, Judith, was quiet but composed, her polite smile never wavering. Sharon could tell it was taking effort. Grace, seated at the head of the table, raised her glass. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. This dinner is about moving forward, about healing the past. Her words carried a formal elegance, but Sharon noticed the slightest edge, as though Grace were forcing herself to step into unfamiliar territory. Judith nodded graciously. We appreciate the invitation. It's not often families get a chance like this. Sharon's Uncle Robert cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Well, it's certainly different. His attempt at light humor fell flat, and Sharon shot him a warning glance. He seemed to shrink slightly in his seat, returning his attention to his plate. The first course was served, and the table fell into an uneasy silence as everyone picked at their food. Sharon couldn't help but notice how her mother's side of the family, used to casual gatherings and simple meals, looked slightly out of place amidst the opulence. Her aunt leaned closer to Sharon, whispering, "Is this what every meal here is like? Feels more like a museum than a dinner." Sharon stifled a laugh but didn't respond, her eyes flicking to Grace, who was watching them with the same careful detachment she always seemed to carry. It was like watching two worlds collide, and Sharon wasn't sure if either would emerge unscathed. As the main course was served, the tension finally boiled over. Grace, trying to make conversation, turned to Judith. I must admit, I've always wondered how you and Michael managed to run that diner of yours. It must have been quite challenging. Judith's smile faltered for the first time. It was hard work, but Michael loved it. He believed in creating a space where people felt welcome, no matter who they were. Grace nodded, but there was something in her expression, an unspoken judgment that Judith clearly noticed. I suppose that's admirable. Though I always thought Michael's talents could have been put to better use. Sharon froze, her fork hovering midair. Her mother's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. Michael's talents were exactly where they needed to be. He built a life he was proud of, one he loved. Grace sipped her wine, her eyes narrowing slightly. I'm sure he did. But it's a shame he felt the need to separate himself from his family entirely. We could have supported him in ways the diner never could. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Sharon felt the first crack of her patience. Maybe he didn't want that support, she said, her voice sharp enough to draw everyone's attention. Maybe he was happy with what he had. Grace's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, they locked eyes in a silent battle. Happiness is subjective, Sharon. Sometimes people settle for less than they deserve because they don't see what's possible. Sharon's temper flared. And sometimes people are perfectly happy until someone else tells them they shouldn't be. The room fell silent, the clinking of silverware against plates ceasing altogether. Judith placed a hand on Sharon's arm, a silent plea for calm, but Sharon wasn't finished. She turned to Grace fully, her voice trembling but resolute. Look, I know you think you're doing the right thing by reaching out now, and maybe you are. But don't sit here and act like my dad was missing something in his life just because it didn't fit into your version of success. He didn't need your approval to be happy. And neither do I. Grace blinked, clearly caught off guard. Sharon, that's not what I... No, Sharon interrupted, her voice gaining strength. I've spent my whole life hearing stories about how my dad made people feel valued and loved. I've heard customers talk about how much that diner meant to them. That's his legacy. Not this house, or the money, or whatever you think he gave up. And if you can't respect that, or the family he built, then maybe we don't need to do this. Judith's grip on Sharon's arm tightened, her voice calm but firm. Sharon. Sharon glanced at her mother, her anger softening slightly. No, Mom. I'm not my father, and I've lived just fine without this family my whole life. I didn't come here to watch you be disrespected for choices you made out of love. The silence that followed was heavy and unyielding. Grace looked as though she was searching for words but couldn't find them. Finally, she set her glass down with deliberate care, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the guilt beneath. "I never meant to disrespect you, Judith," she said quietly, her voice losing its usual polish. "And Sharon, you're right. I made mistakes I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I invited you here tonight because I want to make things right. I want to understand the family Michael built, even if I wasn't part of it." Sharon's defenses faltered slightly at the sincerity in Grace's tone. For a moment, she saw the woman behind the mask of elegance and propriety, a woman who had lost a son and was desperate not to lose the chance to know his daughter. The rest of the dinner passed in subdued quiet. Grace made an effort to steer the conversation to lighter topics, though the tension never fully disappeared. By the time dessert was served, Sharon felt emotionally drained. When the evening finally ended, she hugged her mother tightly before walking her to the door, the weight of the night pressing heavily on her chest. As the guests left and the mansion grew quiet, Sharon found herself lingering in the dining room, staring at the empty table. Grace approached her, her steps hesitant. "I know tonight didn't go as smoothly as I'd hoped," Grace said, her voice soft. "But I meant what I said. I want to do better. For you. For your mother. For all of us." Sharon looked at her grandmother, searching for any sign of pretense but finding none. "We'll see," she said finally, echoing the words she'd spoken to Robert not long ago. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The days following the dinner were quiet but not without reflection. Sharon returned to her small apartment, grateful for the familiar walls that allowed her to think clearly. Her mother had hugged her tightly before leaving the mansion, her pride and gratitude unspoken but evident in the warmth of her touch. Still, Sharon couldn't shake the lingering weight of everything that had been said, or left unsaid. Grace's words had stayed with her, particularly the admission of regret and the longing for change. There had been a sincerity in her voice that Sharon hadn't expected, a crack in the carefully maintained armor that hinted at a genuine desire for something more. But wanting change and creating it were two very different things. Sharon wasn't sure if Grace could bridge the gap. A week passed before Sharon received a call from her grandmother. The voice on the other end was softer than she remembered, lacking its usual air of command. Grace didn't ask for anything outright. Instead, she invited Sharon to lunch at the mansion, just the two of them. Against her better judgment, or perhaps because of it, Sharon agreed. When she arrived, the atmosphere was noticeably different. The grand dining room was nowhere in sight. Instead, Grace led her to the cozy sunroom, where a small table had been set with tea and finger sandwiches. The setting felt far less intimidating, almost warm. "Thank you for coming," Grace said as they sat down. "I wanted us to talk without the distractions of a crowd." Sharon studied her grandmother carefully, noting the slight tension in her hands as they rested on the table. "I'm here," she replied, her tone cautious but open. Grace took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at dinner. You were right. About your father, about his choices, about me. I spent so much time holding on to what I thought was important that I lost sight of what really mattered." Sharon's gaze softened slightly, though she remained guarded. "It's not easy to admit that." "No, it's not," Grace agreed, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But it's necessary. I've lived my life by rules and expectations that, in the end, brought me nothing but regret. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes." Sharon leaned forward, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "So what does that mean? For you? For us?" Grace met her eyes, her expression earnest. "It means I want to do better. I want to know you, Sharon. Not because I feel obligated, but because I care. And I want to know your mother and her family, too. They're a part of you, and if I can't accept them, then I don't deserve to be in your life." The words took Sharon by surprise. She had braced herself for another polished attempt at reconciliation, but this felt different. There was no agenda, no performance, just a woman trying to make amends for years of mistakes. "I appreciate that," Sharon said finally. "But this isn't just about words. It's about action. If you want to be part of my life, you have to be willing to meet me where I am, not where you think I should be." Grace nodded, her resolve clear. "I understand. And I'm ready to do that." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and for the first time, Sharon felt a hint of ease in her grandmother's presence. They spoke of Sharon's favorite dishes to cook, her memories of her father, and even small anecdotes about the bistro. Grace shared stories of Michael's childhood, painting a picture of a boy Sharon had never known but felt connected to in new ways. A week later, Grace extended another invitation, this time to a gathering at the mansion. Unlike the formal dinner, this event was smaller and more casual, with Sharon's mother and extended family included once again. Sharon was hesitant, but her mother encouraged her, reminding her that change often came in small, deliberate steps. When Sharon and Judith arrived, the mansion felt transformed. Gone were the stiff arrangements and polished formalities. Instead, the space was filled with warmth, candles flickered on side tables, soft music played in the background, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted from the kitchen. Grace greeted them at the door, her demeanor relaxed but genuine. She hugged Judith, a gesture that seemed to surprise them both, and then turned to Sharon. "Thank you for being here," she said softly, her voice carrying a sincerity that didn't need embellishment. The gathering was a blend of both families, with laughter and conversation weaving through the rooms. Robert was there, making a clear effort to be more approachable, and though Sharon was still wary, she acknowledged his attempts with a nod of approval. The real moment of connection came when Grace invited everyone into the kitchen. To Sharon's surprise, she rolled up her sleeves and asked Judith to help her prepare a dish from Michael's old recipe book. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. As they worked side by side, the past seemed to soften, replaced by a tentative but hopeful sense of unity. Sharon watched from the counter, her heart swelling as she saw her mother laugh at something Grace said. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't erase the years of hurt, but it was a beginning. And for now, that was enough. As the evening wound down, Grace called for everyone's attention. Standing in the middle of the room, she raised her glass, her voice steady but emotional. "This family has seen its share of division and mistakes, many of them my own. But tonight, I see something new, possibility. Sharon, Judith, to your family and to mine, I want to say thank you for giving me this chance. I hope it's the first of many." Sharon felt her throat tighten as she raised her glass in response. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace, not because everything was resolved, but because it was finally moving in the right direction. Later that night, as she stood on the mansion's front steps, Sharon looked back at Grace. "You're trying," she said simply, her voice carrying a note of approval. Grace smiled, her eyes soft with gratitude. "And I'll keep trying. I promise." As Sharon and her mother drove home, the warmth of the evening lingered. It wasn't just about mending old wounds, it was about building something new, something better. Together, they were crafting a future that honored the past while embracing the possibilities of what lay ahead. For the first time, Sharon felt the ties of family not as chains, but as threads, delicate yet resilient, binding them together in a way that finally felt right.